The morning of October 15th, 2004, began like any other in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Oakwood Heights, Pennsylvania. 12-year-old Daniel Rivera grabbed his backpack, kissed his mother Eleanor goodbye, and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The maple trees lining Elm Street had begun their seasonal transformation, painting the sidewalks in shades of amber and gold. Daniel's walk to Jefferson Middle School was a familiar one, just 4 blocks through the heart of their close-knit community, where neighbors knew each other's names and children played freely in front yards until dusk. The October morning carried that distinctive Pennsylvania chill that promised winter wasn't far behind, and Daniel pulled his navy blue hoodie closer as he began his routine walk to school. Elena Rivera watched from the kitchen window as her son disappeared around the corner of Elm Street, just as she had done hundreds of times before. At 38, Elena worked as a registered nurse at Oakwood General Hospital, a job that had become even more crucial to the family's survival since her husband Miguel's construction accident 6 months earlier. The accident had left Miguel with chronic back problems and unable to continue his work as a foreman, forcing the family to rely primarily on Elena's income. Despite the financial pressures, the Riveras maintained a close, loving household, where Daniel had taken on additional responsibilities, helping with his 9-year-old sister Sophia and proving himself mature beyond his years. Daniel was the kind of child teachers and neighbors consistently praised. His 6th-grade teacher, Mrs. Campbell, often commented on his kindness toward younger students and his willingness to help classmates who struggled with their studies. He played on the school's soccer team and had recently expressed interest in joining the debate club, showing an intellectual curiosity that made his parents proud. His room was filled with books about history and science, and he had a particular fascination with astronomy that led to many evening conversations with his father about constellations and space exploration. But Daniel never made it to school that day. Somewhere between his front door at 847 Elm Street and the corner of Maple Avenue just 1 block away, he simply vanished without a trace, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. Before we dive deeper into this haunting mystery that would consume a community for nearly 2 decades, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light and ensures we can continue investigating cases like Daniel's. Elena Rivera first noticed something was wrong when Jefferson Middle School called at 10:30 a.m. to report Daniel's absence from his first period math class. A knot of anxiety immediately formed in her stomach as she assured the attendance clerk that her son had left for school at his usual time of 7:43 a.m. Elena had been working a double shift at the hospital, covering for a colleague who had called in sick, and she was already exhausted from the demanding pace of the emergency department. She trusted Daniel's routine implicitly. He had been walking to school independently for 2 years and had never given them cause for concern. He was responsible, punctual, and understood the importance of education in a way that made both parents beam with pride. When Elena called Daniel's cell phone from the hospital break room, her hands trembling slightly as she dialed the familiar number, it went straight to voicemail. She tried his best friend Jake Patterson, whose mother confirmed that Jake had been on the school bus that morning and hadn't seen Daniel at all. The Patterson family lived 6 blocks away, and Daniel usually walked while Jake rode the bus due to the distance. Elena's supervisor, recognizing the panic in her voice, immediately arranged coverage so she could leave work to search for her son. By noon, Elena had left Oakwood General Hospital and was driving slowly down Elm Street in her aging Honda Civic, her eyes scanning every yard, every alley, every possible place a 12-year-old boy might be hiding or might have gotten hurt. The autumn sun felt mockingly bright against the growing darkness in her chest, and she found herself checking her phone every few seconds, hoping for a call or text from Daniel explaining where he was. She stopped at Henderson's Market, where Daniel sometimes bought candy with his allowance, but the elderly owner, Mr. Singh, hadn't seen the boy that morning. Miguel, despite his injured back and the constant pain that had plagued him since the construction accident, insisted on joining the search when Elena called him at home. The accident had occurred when a scaffolding collapsed at a downtown renovation project, leaving Miguel with 3 compressed vertebrae and a permanent disability that had fundamentally altered their family's financial situation. His pride had taken as much of a beating as his spine, and the inability to provide for his family in the way he always had created a constant undercurrent of frustration in their household. However, when it came to his missing son, Miguel's protective instincts overrode any physical limitations. Together, Elena and Miguel knocked on every door within a 6-block radius of their home, their desperation growing with each conversation. Mrs. Henderson from 852 Elm Street, an elderly widow who spent most mornings tending to her elaborate flower garden, remembered seeing Daniel walking past her kitchen window around 7:45 a.m. She recalled that he had his backpack slung over his shoulder and appeared normal and unhurried, perhaps even stopping briefly to pet her cat, Whiskers, who often lounged on the front porch. That sighting was the last confirmed time anyone remembered seeing Daniel Rivera alive. Mr. Robert Peterson, who lived at 845 Elm Street directly on Daniel's route to school, told the concerned parents that he had been backing out of his driveway around 7:45 a.m., but didn't recall seeing the boy at all. This struck both Elena and Miguel as odd, since Daniel's route would have taken him directly past Peterson's house, and the man's driveway offered a clear view of the sidewalk. Peterson, a quiet man in his mid-50s, who worked as an accountant for a local manufacturing company, seemed genuinely concerned about Daniel's disappearance and offered to help with the search in any way possible. By 3 p.m., when Sophia arrived home from Oakwood Elementary School on her usual bus, asking in her innocent 9-year-old voice where her big brother was, Eleanor made the phone call that would change their lives forever. Her hands shook as she dialed 911, and she had to repeat herself twice because her voice kept breaking. The dispatcher was patient and professional, but Elena could sense the urgency building on the other end of the line as she explained that her 12-year-old son had been missing for over 7 hours. Detective James Crawford of the Oakwood Heights Police Department arrived at the Rivera house within 20 minutes of Elena's call, his unmarked sedan pulling up in front of the modest 2-story home that the family had purchased 8 years earlier when Daniel was just 4 years old. Crawford, a veteran investigator with 15 years of experience in missing persons cases, stepped out of his car and surveyed the neighborhood with practiced eyes. At 52, he had seen enough missing children cases to know that time was absolutely critical, and something about this particular disappearance, the proximity to home, the sudden vanishing, the complete lack of witnesses despite it being a school morning in a busy residential area, set off alarm bells in his experienced mind. Crawford's initial assessment of the Rivera family was positive. The parents were clearly distraught but cooperative, answering his questions thoroughly and providing detailed information about Daniel's routine, personality, and recent behavior. There were no obvious signs of family dysfunction, abuse, or the kind of problems that sometimes led children to run away from home. Miguel's injury had created financial stress, but the family had been coping well, and Daniel had actually stepped up to help more around the house, rather than acting out or showing signs of behavioral problems. The detective established a detailed timeline with military precision. Daniel had left home at exactly 7:43 a.m. Elena remembered because she had been watching the morning news and noted the time when she kissed him goodbye. Mrs. Henderson had seen him 2 minutes later at 7:45 a.m., walking at his normal pace and appearing completely normal. The walk to Jefferson Middle School should have taken Daniel approximately 15 minutes, meaning he should have arrived well before the 8:15 a.m. first bell. The school had a strict attendance policy, and Daniel had never been late without calling ahead. The distance from the Rivera house to the school was exactly 7 miles, all through safe residential streets that Daniel had walked hundreds of times over the past 2 years. Crawford immediately dispatched patrol officers to conduct a more thorough canvass of the neighborhood, checking basement windows, abandoned buildings, storm drains, and the small Oakwood Creek that ran behind the commercial district about half a mile from Daniel's route. The creek had been a concern for parents in the area, particularly during spring floods, but it was currently running low due to an unusually dry October, and initial searches revealed no signs of disturbance along its banks. Specialized search and rescue dogs arrived from the county sheriff's department within 4 hours of the initial report. The German shepherds, trained specifically in tracking missing persons, were given Daniel's scent from clothing in his bedroom and immediately began working the route from his house toward the school. The dogs picked up a strong scent trail that followed Daniel's normal path along Elm Street, but the trail seemed to vanish completely at the intersection of Elm Street and Maple Avenue, as if Daniel had simply ceased to exist at that exact location. The mysterious disappearance of the scent trail troubled the dog handlers, who had decades of experience in search and rescue operations. Typically, when someone gets into a vehicle, dogs can still follow the scent for some distance along the road. When someone is injured or attacked, there are usually signs of disturbance, and the scent pattern changes dramatically. But Daniel's trail simply ended abruptly at the corner, with no indication of what might have happened to him. This unusual pattern suggested either that Daniel had gotten into a vehicle voluntarily with someone he trusted, or that something had happened so quickly that there was no opportunity for struggle or resistance. The media attention began on day 3 of Daniel's disappearance, when WPVI-TV in Philadelphia picked up the story during their evening newscast. Local reporter Amanda Cross conducted the first television interview with Elena and Miguel Rivera, broadcasting their desperate plea for information about their missing son. Elena, her eyes red from crying but her voice steady with determination, looked directly into the camera and said, "Daniel is a good boy. He's smart, he's careful, and he would never just run away. Someone out there knows what happened to him, and we're begging you to please come forward." The story spread rapidly through regional and then national media outlets. By the end of the first week, CNN, Fox News, and NBC had all featured Daniel's disappearance in their coverage. The image of his school photograph, showing a smiling 12-year-old with dark hair, kind brown eyes, and a slight gap between his front teeth that he was self-conscious about, appeared on missing person alerts across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. The photograph had been taken just 2 months earlier for the school yearbook, and Daniel had been embarrassed about his appearance, not knowing it would become the image that defined the search for him. Detective Crawford expanded the investigation systematically, following protocols developed over years of missing persons cases, while also pursuing his own instincts about what might have happened. The possibility that Daniel had run away was carefully examined and ultimately dismissed. There was no evidence of problems at home, school, or with friends. His bedroom showed no signs that he had packed clothing or taken any personal items. His savings account, which contained $127 from birthday gifts and allowance, remained untouched. Most tellingly, Daniel had been excited about an upcoming field trip to the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia and had been talking about it for weeks. The investigation into possible abduction scenarios proved more complex and disturbing. Crawford's team began the delicate but necessary process of investigating everyone in Daniel's life, from family members to teachers to neighbors to anyone who might have had contact with the boy. This included uncomfortable conversations with relatives, detailed background checks on school employees, and careful scrutiny of neighbors like Robert Peterson, who lived along Daniel's route to school. 3 registered sex offenders lived within a 10-mile radius of the Rivera home, and each was thoroughly investigated and eventually cleared through alibi verification and polygraph tests. The team also looked into recent parolees from state prisons, anyone with a history of crimes against children, and individuals who had been reported for suspicious behavior around local schools. Each lead required hours of investigation, interviews, and documentation, but none yielded evidence connecting them to Daniel's disappearance. The community response to Daniel's disappearance was overwhelming and heartening. Within days of the initial news reports, hundreds of volunteers had organized search parties that combed through every inch of Oakwood Park, the abandoned riverside textile mill on the outskirts of town, and every vacant lot, construction site, and wooded area within a 5-mile radius of the Rivera home. Local businesses donated food, water, and supplies for the searchers. The Oakwood Heights Chamber of Commerce established a reward fund that grew from hundreds to thousands of dollars within the first 2 weeks. Yellow ribbons began appearing on trees throughout the neighborhood, and Daniel's school photograph was posted in every storefront window along Main Street. The local newspaper, the Oakwood Heights Gazette, ran daily updates on the search efforts and featured interviews with family members, friends, and anyone who might have information about Daniel's disappearance. The outpouring of support provided some comfort to the Rivera family, but it also added pressure and complexity to an already overwhelming situation. As days turned into weeks, the investigation took on a more systematic and methodical approach. Crawford's team analyzed phone records from the Rivera household and from neighbors, looking for any unusual calls or patterns that might provide clues. They reviewed security footage from the few businesses along Daniel's route, though most of the cameras had limited range and poor resolution. The team also conducted extensive psychological evaluations of potential suspects and began building profiles of the type of person who might have taken Daniel. The psychological toll on the Rivera family became increasingly evident as the weeks passed. Elena threw herself completely into the search efforts, taking extended leave from her job at the hospital to organize volunteer groups, coordinate with other families of missing children across the country, and learn everything she could about missing persons investigations. She contacted the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, attended conferences on child abduction, and maintained relationships with private investigators who occasionally offered pro bono assistance on high-profile cases. Miguel struggled more visibly with the situation. His physical limitations from the construction accident, combined with the emotional trauma of losing his son and feeling helpless to find him, led to periods of deep depression and withdrawal. He began drinking more heavily, something that created additional tension in the household and worried Elena, who was already stretched to her emotional limits. The financial pressure of Elena's reduced work schedule, combined with the costs associated with the search efforts, created another layer of stress that threatened to tear the family apart. 9-year-old Sophia became a forgotten victim in many ways, as her parents' attention was necessarily focused on finding her missing brother. She struggled to understand why Daniel had disappeared and why everyone was so sad all the time. Her grades at school began to suffer, and she developed anxiety-related behaviors like nail-biting and difficulty sleeping. The school counselor worked with Sophia regularly, but the child's world had been fundamentally altered, and the effects would last far beyond the initial crisis period. 3 months after Daniel's disappearance, Detective Crawford made a decision that would prove crucial to the eventual resolution of the case nearly 2 decades later. Despite increasing pressure from his superiors to scale back the active investigation and reassign resources to newer cases, Crawford meticulously documented every piece of evidence, every interview, every possible lead, and every investigative theory in a comprehensive case file that eventually filled 4 large binders. He had developed an intuitive feeling, one he couldn't quite articulate, but had learned to trust over his years of police work, that this case would eventually be solved. But not through traditional investigative methods and not in the time frame that anyone expected. Crawford's detailed documentation included photographs of the search areas, transcripts of every interview, copies of all physical evidence, detailed maps showing Daniel's route and the locations where various pieces of evidence had been collected, and psychological profiles of potential suspects. He also maintained careful records of all tips and leads, no matter how unlikely they seemed at the time. This thorough approach went well beyond department requirements and reflected Crawford's personal commitment to eventually finding answers for the Rivera family. The first anniversary of Daniel's disappearance brought renewed media attention and a fresh wave of tips from the public. Most of these leads went nowhere, but Crawford followed up on each one with the same thoroughness he had applied to the original investigation. A caller from Ohio claimed to have seen a boy matching Daniel's description at a truck stop near Cleveland. Investigation revealed it was a 16-year-old runaway from the local area who bore only a superficial resemblance to Daniel. Another tip suggested Daniel had been spotted at King of Prussia Mall outside Philadelphia. Security footage analysis showed a different child entirely, accompanied by what appeared to be his legitimate family. Each false lead represented another emotional roller coaster for the Rivera family. Elena would feel a surge of hope when Crawford called to report a new tip, followed by crushing disappointment when the lead proved false. These cycles of hope and despair took an enormous psychological toll, and Elena began working with a therapist who specialized in helping families of missing children cope with the unique challenges they faced. The therapist helped Elena understand that maintaining hope was important, but that she also needed to find ways to continue living while Daniel remained missing. By the second anniversary of Daniel's disappearance, the active investigation had largely wound down due to resource constraints and the lack of new leads. Crawford kept the case file open and continued to follow up on credible tips when they came in, but the Oakwood Heights Police Department was small and other cases demanded immediate attention. The yellow ribbons that had once been ubiquitous throughout the neighborhood gradually faded and disappeared. Daniel's missing person posters, which had been posted in every business window and on every telephone pole in the area, were slowly removed or covered by newer announcements and advertisements. Life in Oakwood Heights slowly returned to something resembling its normal rhythm, though the Rivera family remained frozen in their grief and uncertainty. Elena eventually returned to work at the hospital, but she was never quite the same nurse she had been before Daniel's disappearance. She had seen too much of the darker side of human nature and had learned that terrible things could happen to innocent children in broad daylight, even in the safest communities. Her work in the emergency department took on new meaning as she encountered other families dealing with trauma and loss. Elena never stopped searching for her son, even as the years passed and other people moved on with their lives. She joined support groups for families of missing children, traveled to conferences about investigative techniques and victim advocacy, and maintained relationships with private investigators, retired police officers, and other families who had experienced similar tragedies. She learned about advances in DNA analysis, cell phone tracking technology, and database systems that might someday help locate Daniel, or at least provide answers about what had happened to him. Miguel eventually returned to light construction work, though his injury prevented him from ever again doing the heavy labor that had been his specialty. He found employment with a local contractor doing finish work and project management, jobs that were less physically demanding, but also paid significantly less than his previous position. The family's financial situation stabilized somewhat, but they never recovered the economic security they had enjoyed before Miguel's accident and Daniel's disappearance. The combination of these two traumatic events had fundamentally altered their trajectory as a family. Sophia grew up in the shadow of her missing brother, becoming a quiet, introspective teenager who excelled academically but struggled with social relationships. She was always aware that she was the sister of that missing boy, and the attention made her uncomfortable. Teachers and classmates often treated her with a kind of cautious sympathy that she found suffocating. She developed a passion for psychology and criminal justice, partly as a way of understanding what had happened to Daniel, and partly as a way of helping other families who might face similar situations. Detective Crawford retired from the Oakwood Heights Police Department in 2015, but Daniel Rivera's case remained one of the investigations that haunted him throughout his retirement. In his final years with the department, Crawford had begun exploring cold case investigation techniques, learning about advances in DNA analysis, cell phone technology, digital forensics, and database systems that hadn't existed when Daniel first disappeared. He made sure that his replacement, Detective Maria Santos, understood the importance of the Rivera case and was thoroughly familiar with every detail of the original investigation. Detective Santos, a young investigator with a background in technology and modern forensic techniques, inherited not only Crawford's detailed case files, but also his commitment to eventually finding answers. Santos reviewed the case annually, looking for new approaches that might yield information that had been missed in the original investigation. She also maintained regular contact with the Rivera family, providing updates when new investigative techniques became available and ensuring them that Daniel's case remained a priority for the department. The breakthrough that would finally solve Daniel Rivera's disappearance came in an unexpected way, nearly 19 years after he had vanished on that October morning. In March 2023, the old Peterson house at 845 Elm Street was finally being prepared for sale after sitting empty since Robert Peterson's death 3 years earlier. Peterson had lived alone in the house for most of his adult life, working as an accountant and maintaining a quiet, unremarkable existence that had never drawn attention from neighbors or law enforcement. Peterson's adult daughter, who lived in California and had inherited the property, decided to renovate the house before putting it on the market. The house was old and had developed several problems over the years, including a persistent moisture issue in the basement that had been getting worse. When construction workers began tearing out the basement walls to address the moisture problem and update the electrical system, they discovered something that building records indicated shouldn't have existed: a small hidden room behind the furnace that was completely concealed from normal view. The discovery of the hidden room immediately raised red flags for the construction foreman, who had worked on enough renovations to know that secret spaces were often used for illegal activities. When the workers broke through the false wall, they found a small, windowless room, about 8 feet by 10 feet, that had been carefully constructed to be completely soundproof and invisible from the outside. The room contained items that made the construction crew immediately contact the police. Inside that hidden room, investigators found Daniel Rivera's backpack, still containing his school notebooks and homework from October 15, 2004. They found his cell phone, a Nokia model that had been popular among teenagers at the time. They found clothing that DNA analysis would later confirm belonged to Daniel. But most disturbing of all, they found an extensive collection of photographs, journals, and other materials that painted a horrifying picture of Robert Peterson's secret obsession with the children in his neighborhood. Peterson's journals, written in meticulous handwriting and dating back several years before Daniel's disappearance, detailed months of watching the boy's routine, learning his schedule, noting his habits, and planning what Peterson euphemistically referred to in his writings as developing a special friendship with Daniel. The journals revealed that Peterson had been observing not just Daniel, but several children in the neighborhood, taking photographs of them without their knowledge, and documenting their daily routines with obsessive detail. The most chilling entries in Peterson's journals described his preparation for Daniel's abduction. He had noticed that Daniel always walked to school alone, taking the same route every day. He had timed the walk repeatedly, noting that there was approximately a 3-minute window when Daniel would be passing directly in front of his house with no other pedestrians or vehicles typically in sight. Peterson had even practiced his approach, working out exactly what he would say to lure Daniel into his house without arousing suspicion. The truth that emerged from Peterson's hidden room was more horrific than anyone had imagined, revealing the methodical planning and execution of a crime that had devastated a family and community for nearly 2 decades. On the morning of October 15, 2004, Peterson had not been backing out of his driveway as he had told police during the original investigation. Instead, he had been positioned in his car, waiting for Daniel to appear on his daily walk to school, ready to implement a plan he had been developing for months. According to Peterson's detailed journal entries, he had approached Daniel on the sidewalk with a carefully prepared story about a hurt animal in his basement that needed help. Peterson knew that Daniel was a compassionate child who loved animals. He had observed Daniel playing with neighborhood cats and dogs during his surveillance. The ruse worked exactly as Peterson had planned, and Daniel followed him into the house, concerned about helping an injured creature that didn't actually exist. Once inside the house, Peterson had overpowered Daniel and imprisoned him in the hidden room that he had spent months preparing for exactly this purpose. The soundproof construction meant that Daniel could scream and cry without being heard by neighbors or passers-by. Peterson's journals described holding Daniel captive for several days, while the entire community searched frantically for the missing boy, even as Peterson himself participated in search efforts and spoke with concerned neighbors about the disappearance. The journals revealed Peterson's twisted psychology in disturbing detail. He wrote about watching the search efforts from his windows, observing Elena and Miguel Rivera as they knocked on doors looking for their son, and feeling a sense of power and control over the situation. He described the search dogs coming to his house and being unable to detect Daniel's presence in the hidden room. He even wrote about his conversations with Detective Crawford during the initial investigation, noting how easy it was to deceive the police officer who was working so desperately to find Daniel. Peterson's own words revealed that he had killed Daniel after keeping him imprisoned for approximately 6 days. The journals described his actions with chilling detachment and expressed no remorse for the pain he had caused the Rivera family or the broader community. Instead, Peterson seemed to view the entire experience as a successful implementation of his careful planning, and he wrote about his confidence that he would never be caught because he had been so methodical in his approach. The final piece of the puzzle came from Peterson's description of how he had disposed of Daniel's body. According to the journals, he had driven to a remote section of the Susquehanna River, about 30 miles from Oakwood Heights, where he had weighted down Daniel's body with concrete blocks and submerged it in deep water. The location he described was in a section of the river that was rarely visited by fishermen or boaters, and where the current was strong enough to move anything that might work loose from its moorings. Recovery efforts began immediately after Peterson's journals were discovered, but after nearly 20 years underwater, investigators held little hope of finding significant physical evidence. The Pennsylvania State Police dive team spent 2 weeks searching the section of river that Peterson had described, using sonar equipment and underwater cameras to examine the river bottom. What they eventually found were metal fragments from Daniel's belt buckle and several small bone fragments that DNA analysis conclusively identified as belonging to Daniel Rivera. Detective Santos held a press conference on a grey October morning in 2023, almost exactly 19 years after Daniel's disappearance, to announce that the case had finally been solved. Elena and Miguel Rivera, now in their late 50s, sat in the front row of the community center where the press conference was held, holding hands and crying as Santos explained what investigators had discovered in Robert Peterson's hidden room. Sophia, now 28 years old and working as a middle school teacher, stood behind her parents with her own young daughter, the granddaughter that Daniel would never meet. The case closure brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief to the Rivera family and the entire Oakwood Heights community. After nearly 2 decades of uncertainty, they finally had answers about what had happened to Daniel. But those answers confirmed their worst fears about the evil that had been hiding in their neighborhood. Daniel had been taken by someone who lived just 1 block away from his house, someone who had watched him and planned his abduction while appearing to be a normal, harmless neighbor. The revelation that Robert Peterson had been Daniel's killer sent shockwaves through Oakwood Heights. Peterson had lived in the community for over 20 years, working as an accountant for Riverside Manufacturing and maintaining what appeared to be a quiet, unremarkable existence. He had no criminal record, had never been the subject of police investigation, and had been regarded by neighbors as someone who kept to himself, but was generally harmless. The realization that such calculated evil could hide behind such a normal facade shook the fundamental sense of security that residents of the small Pennsylvania town had taken for granted. In the weeks following the revelation, community members struggled to process the truth about Peterson and to reconcile their memories of him with the horrific reality of what he had done. Several neighbors recalled interactions with Peterson during the original search for Daniel, remembering how concerned and helpful he had seemed. The knowledge that he had been participating in search efforts while holding Daniel captive in his basement added another layer of horror to an already unthinkable crime. Elena Rivera, now 57 years old and working part-time at the hospital, while devoting much of her time to victim advocacy, spoke at a memorial service held where Peterson's house had once stood. The house had been demolished shortly after the discovery, and the lot had been converted into a small memorial garden. "My son was a beautiful, innocent child who deserved to grow up, to go to college, to have children of his own," Elena said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Robert Peterson stole all of that from Daniel, from our family, and from this community. But Daniel's memory will live on in this garden, and maybe his story will help other families stay safe and aware of the dangers that can hide in plain sight." The Daniel Rivera case became a textbook example for law enforcement agencies across the country, illustrating how predators can successfully hide in plain sight for years and how important it is to never give up on missing children cases, no matter how much time has passed. Detective Crawford, now fully retired but still following the case resolution, noted that advances in investigation techniques, improved documentation practices, and the persistence of law enforcement had finally brought justice after 19 long years. Daniel's family waited far too long for answers, Crawford said in an interview after the case was closed. But at least they finally know the truth, and Peterson can never hurt another child. Today, the small memorial garden that grows where Peterson's house once stood serves as a lasting tribute to Daniel Rivera's memory and a reminder of both the devastating loss and the resilience of the human spirit. Elena tends the garden regularly, planting flowers that bloom each October in memory of her son and in recognition of the other children who have been lost to similar crimes. Sophia brings her own daughter to the garden sometimes, telling her about the uncle she never met, but whose memory remains strong in their family's heart. The garden features a small bronze plaque with Daniel's photograph and the dates of his birth and death, along with a quote that Elena chose, "In loving memory of Daniel Rivera, taken too soon but never forgotten. May his light continue to shine in the lives of all who remember him." The memorial serves as both a place of mourning and a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of unthinkable evil, love persists, families endure, and communities can come together to ensure that victims are never truly forgotten.